Yeah, hello, my name is Joachim Koops. I'm the Dean of Vesalius College at the Free University of Brussels, and I'm also a research professor at the Institute for European Studies here at the VUB. Today's lecture, our conversation in a sense, is about the relationship between transparency, accountability, democracy, and the responsibility of the citizen as such. The big picture really in that is that in recent years there has been a move, especially a mass move if we think about the internet and WikiLeaks and transparency platforms, about or towards disclosure of information, better access of citizens to key information and understanding of decision-making processes of governments or international organizations. An increased call for accountability, especially in global governance, but also at the European level. If we only think about the Euro crisis now and the IMF and the Troika approaches to countries. And the question as such is, how can we as responsible citizens or how our youth voters, in a sense, engage more in politics as a result of more disclosure or more readiness of information? Or, put the other way around, and we'll explore this a bit in this lecture, to what extent might it not actually matter? To what extent might more information not make us better citizens or make us more active citizens? Is there really a link between disclosing information, having more access to information, having a more transparent government, and having a more active citizen, more democratic and participatory process? So, very briefly, in the next 20 minutes, this is going to be divided into three parts. First, I'm going to look at the issue of transparency, then accountability, and then how transparency and accountability might be linked to the concept of deliberative and participatory democracy, i.e. what's in it for the responsible citizen who wants to make an impact in European, national or global politics. Now, there is a long academic tradition about a certain form of democracy. Democracy not as representative democracy, i.e. you vote a representative into a parliament who then will speak and make decisions on your behalf, but there is a strand of democracy called deliberative or participatory democracy. Early thinkers about this are particularly Bassetti, but also the political theorist John Rawls or Jürgen Habermas. The idea about deliberative democracy is what it actually says. Citizens need to deliberate, need to think, need to reflect about politics, decision-making, key aspects of national and international governance. In order to reflect and rethink properly, you need information. You cannot be able to really reason about any kind of action your government does, whether it's domestic politics or foreign policy, if you don't really have access or if you don't really have the full picture of what the options, the reasons, the motivations behind these decisions are. So, for example, whether or not we could be in favor of, let's say, an intervention in a foreign country, whether it's Syria or Iraq, as in recent history throw up some examples. Really we need to know what are the implications, what are the motivations, which are the players, which are the interests, the lobbyists for this government decision. If the government speaks on our behalf in foreign policy decisions, such as a decision to go to war, we need to know what the motivations are. So deliberative democracy works both at the foreign policy level, international level, what our states or our governments do in our names abroad and in global governance, but also domestically. Decisions that are made on dividing resources, allocating resources, who gets what, spending cuts we might make on welfare provisions vis-a-vis or versus military expenditure or the corporate tax. We need to have the information, full picture to make a good decision. Most recent example, of course, is the referendum in Greece. Did Greek citizens really have full access to full information? Do they really know what the implications were of the European or Eurogroups and IMF's bailout offer, and so on and so forth? So for every major participatory effect, especially, for example, referenda, which are some institutionalized ideas of governments to get more participation of citizens, we need, of course, also information. So deliberative democracy is a particular type of democracy, and it's rooted in the political theory of liberalism. Already Immanuel Kant, one of the forethinkers of Enlightenment and liberalism, in his short treatise, The Perpetual Peace, already talked about the fact that secret treaties by governments should be abolished and avoided at all costs. So what we have there is an idea of transparency. Transparency, again, there's massive literature on about both defining transparency, quantifying transparency. There's also a strand that came out during the last 10 years of critical transparency studies, in a sense, questioning whether transparency as such really is a good option for democracy. But all authors agree on a common basic assumption, and transparency means openness, and it means a free flow of information about core processes. It also means fair and, in a sense, accurate access to information. Now, there has been recently, during the last 10 years, a movement towards what could be called full transparency movements or radical transparency. What does that mean? It means essentially that no information whatsoever in the political process or the government should be kept back. The question here is also about legitimacy. Who at the end makes a decision about which information could be held back and which information should be released? So there's a question of power, there's a question of legitimacy, there's a question of, in governments, if someone puts the stamp classified on a document, well, on which basis? And who has the right to withhold certain information from citizens? At the end of the day, in democracies, the argument goes, governments are there to represent us and serve us. We pay our taxes also, so they will act in our name. So all information about the decisions they do with our delegated power and money, we should know about. The idea of full transparency, radical transparency, has been embodied, of course, in the WikiLeaks movement. So WikiLeaks, as a transparency platform, combines both the philosophy of full radical transparency and with advances in technology that allows, for the first time in history, mass leaks. Previously, leaking and whistleblowing was very intensive, resource intensive, very difficult. You had to photocopy things in secret. It would take years. For example, in the 70s, the Pentagon Papers case, that was something done at big personal risk and over a long period of time. But with the internet, with information flows and digitalized data and information, you can very quickly release a massive trough of information. And we come back to the example of WikiLeaks. Next point is transparency in that sense is also then linked to accountability. We want to know who was responsible for certain action. So again, if we think about the financial rescue packages, as it's called now, in the financial crisis with Greece, citizens need to know who is behind that certain package, who is behind a demand, for example, for increasing corporate or decreasing corporate taxes, decreasing welfare spending. It becomes even more complicated because not only do you have national governments that make a decision, Germany and France having a particular view on this, but you have the European level, so the Commission and the Central Bank, having their influence on negotiations, and the global level, the International Monetary Fund. Yet, they're not really as such. I mean, in case of the national level, they are held accountable, or should be, by parliaments, but at the Eurogroup level, there's no real a legally defined accountability process. The IMF is also an international organization that doesn't really have to be held accountable by, let's say, national parliaments. So there is an accountability gap that also leads to a transparency gap. So the forethinkers of transparency and accountability movements are saying democracy really doesn't mean anything if we don't have at least some level of transparency and then link to that accountability. We can all the way go back also in foreign policy to, for example, Woodrow Wilson's 14 points formulated after the end of the First World War. And point one, interesting enough, so the first point apart from everything else is actually about open diplomacy. So Wilson also, in foreign policy, saw as one of the key contributing factors to the outbreak of the First World War the fact that you had secret alliances and secret treaties. So for a peaceful world, the argument goes, you need to have full open disclosure on international treaties, and secret diplomacy should be abolished. So if you think about that 100 years ago, it doesn't seem to be as radical anymore if you think about the current movements of, for example, WikiLeaks or OpenLeaks. In modern days, we have movements by governments to a certain extent to yield to this request for transparency. For example, since 2000s, we have about 90% of all countries that exist in the world right now having passed some sort of information act, freedom of information acts, or legislations that allow citizens or journalists to request certain information if the reason is given. There's a question though about the role of media. Traditionally in democratic theory, the media is the kind of element that controls public policy, that speaks truth to power, that tries to inform citizens. But recently, and that's especially if radical transparency movement advocates would say, there seems to be criticism of the media that it no longer fulfills a critical control role. If we think again about the debate in the US, but also in Europe, over post-terrorism legislations, over international coalitions to go to war in Afghanistan and Iraq, often the media was, in a sense, colluded, or you have this idea of embedded journalists, and the role of critically really assessing government policy, whether it's right or wrong, has kind of been dumped down. That's where the argument goes. We have NGOs, the phenomenon that non-governmental actors, such as Transparency International, for example, or Human Rights Watch, are those that, again, control and check and verify government statistics or claims, and try to verify and also quantify the level of transparency or the level of corruption. And there's a link, for example, Transparency International makes it very clear that corruption, lack of transparency, leads also to lack of democracy and the deterioration of welfare. And then finally you have a revival of whistleblowers and whistleblower platforms. So WikiLeaks is a quick example, and now you have many movements that try to copy it. Brussels Leaks, for example, has a platform that tries to leak documents about the EU. OpenLeaks is a kind of spin-off, one of the co-founders of WikiLeaks who fell out with Assange and then started its own. And you have more and more platforms that try to leak documents about governance. So the idea would be that governments can be held accountable, that information that have been held back is finally available and will allow the citizens to make proper judgment. But the problem is to what extent total transparency might, at the end of the day, affect the functioning of the state, national security, or certain international agreements. The question always is, what's the balance, on the one hand, between the right to know of the citizens and the right of the government to confine certain documentation and certain decisions to classification or delay the publication. Radical advocates would say, well, there's no justification. Any information should be free, because if you have information to hide, you have something to hide, and if you have something to hide, we should know about it, because you're obviously violating laws or principles of justice, etc. But of course, if you break this down to the personal level, or even any organization, let's say a university, to what extent is that really true, and to what extent do we, as personal human beings, allow that to happen? To what extent are we, for example, would we be comfortable with the idea that anything we say, anything we write down, anything we discuss should be in full transparency, and you can no longer discuss anything in secrecy? If we really reflect on it on a depoliticized way, it's quite difficult to see an argument where you are constantly held accountable for any kind of decision, and it has to be any kind of decision you have to make has to be public. But you could envisage a situation where this is indeed the case. The other question is, of course, to what extent there's a balance between the transparent citizen on the one hand, because government collect more and more information about us. We don't even have to go into the big case of the NSA scandal, but simply, through social media, data mining now, government authorities know a lot about us, yet is there the same balance of how much a citizen knows about the government? And finally, how much transparency is, at the end of the day, good for a functioning democracy, and who decides? So at the end of the day, who has the monopoly of making a decision on how much transparency is healthy for democracy? At the moment, politicians make a clear argument that, well, for certain national security elements, you need secrecy, but it has been shown over and over again that it's being violated and used for other means to cover up certain things, or to save certain let's say, unjust policy making. But that's a question to be discussed and to reflect on. Secondly, then, as mentioned before, the relationship between transparency and accountability. Again, in political theory, there are lots of theories and discussions and authors that have written on accountability. So accountability at the national level or at the multinational, European, global level, essentially is linked to responsibility, is linked to legitimacy, and it's linked to being responsible and being able to be held responsible for the actions, for the outcome of your actions, as well as for the processes. So, in terms of theories of power, theories of democracy, accountability is a core aspect. You need to be able to trace back a decision maker and a decision-making process who you will be able to hold responsible for certain actions. If you have diffuse accountability or no accountability, there is a fundamental problem in democratic processes. Now, the link between transparency and accountability, according to those that advocate stronger role of transparency, is you can only have real accountability and knowledge about accountability if, again, you know, have full disclosure about decision-making procedures and structures. Again, I think the current example of the Greek debt crisis and financial crisis is a very, very good example. If you want to make an informed decision about who decides on which policy, on which requirement for fundamental restructuring of a state, of the functioning of an economy, but also the functioning of democracy. I mean, we just had a drawn-out negotiation process in Brussels about a third rescue package. We also had a quite unique anomaly that a national parliament had to vote on very strict requirements, policy requirements that actually emanated not by the parliament itself, which normally is the idea of representative democracy, but by a body of unelected international bureaucrats and policymakers of other states that made these requirements and legislations. Some critics on the far left even talk about a new protectorate or neo-colonialism. While one doesn't have to go that far, there is a clear case here again of accountability when these policies are made and when they have an effect on citizens in Greece, and they will have an effect, wealth effect. The income will be again further halved. There might be political disturbances. Who in the end will be held accountable for the policies and the implementation? Will it be the Greek government? Because the government represents the views and it's elected, there's a direct line. Or the Greek government could say, well, as the Prime Minister did mention, he doesn't believe in the policies but think there is no other choice, otherwise the country would go bankrupt. So here we have a clear case of the line of accountability and who is responsible for certain policies. Now, there was a move towards post-factum transparency. The Commission, for example, published the negotiation mandate a couple of weeks ago on Greece and certain details, but only, it has to be said, 3 days after it was already leaked by mainstream media, by the Financial Times. But we still don't know what role was the IMF playing, who was pushing for which policy, and that again could, by critics, as argued by critics, be a problem for democracy and what might lead to radicalization. Accountability is also a question of tracing the influence of lobbyists, influence of corporate interests. Who is lobbying at the government level for certain legislations? This is also a well-documented problem in the European Parliament. There has been moved towards a transparency register now, for example, that the Commission has advanced, so every company or NGO has to register if they want to have access to certain politicians and decision makers. The key thing is always which interest and which actor pushes for which policy. And that, in a nutshell, is the question of accountability, which might be enhanced by more disclosure and bigger transparency. Finally, then, what does that all mean at the end of the day for us as individual citizens, or as responsible citizens, or responsive citizens, i.e. taking action, or irresponsive citizens? Again, the theory of deliberative democracy is that if you increase transparency, if you increase then calls for accountability, citizens will get more involved, more engaged in the political process because they feel they have a bigger share and say and influence. That was the assumption behind WikiLeaks again. One big claim, for example, that Chelsea Manning, formerly known as Bradley Manning, who was the leaker of all the documents related to Iraq, Afghanistan, and the US campaign and the Western campaign in those countries, military campaigns, said, he essentially said, well, if only people knew about the war crimes, the casualties of civilians, if people knew about it, there would be an uprising and a revolution and there would be more justice in the world. That was his or her full belief. It was the same belief stated differently by Julian Assange, the leader or creator of WikiLeaks. But actually, it could be argued that was not the case. Even though citizens have full information, have massive insights into, I mean, websites have been built, the mainstream media has supported, in a sense, these revelations and analyzed it further. Even though we have the full information, this kind of revolution, if you want, as the information revolution and the, which would then inspire political engagement of people, especially the youth, has not happened. So that's the big puzzle, actually. Even though we seem to be living in an age where more information is available, more transparency is possible, this does not result directly into more political action. So different factors have to be explored. Is it maybe because, in general, we have too much information or an overload of information? The three biggest cases that WikiLeaks, but there are many, many others, interesting ones, ranging from disclosure on tax evasion of a Swiss bank, disclosures about the Icelandic financial crisis, but the three big ones are Iraq, Afghanistan leaks, the diplomatic cables, so really outlining how diplomacy, in a sense, works, even though Woodrow Wilson asked 100 years ago for open diplomacy. You see how secret and how the processes still are. And the collateral murder video that some of you might have seen, where it's clearly documented that an Iraqi military helicopter gunned down civilians and 2 Reuters journalists. And the Pentagon withheld the information, even though Reuters, as a news agency, asked for under the Freedom of Information Act, asked for this video to be released, and this was delayed until WikiLeaks published it, which also shows the limits, by the way, of the Freedom of Information Act and requests for information. If the government doesn't want to give it out, it will not give it out and will delay it. But despite all these revelations, the big outcry and the big movement really hasn't happened. And some authors and commentators say, well, that shows the limits, really, of deliberative democracy and participatory democracy. First of all, the information and the issues might be too complex. You need a moderator that analyzes the information and breaks it down into understandable contexts. Just dumping documents might not be useful for the citizens or even decision makers. Our own research group here at Vesalius College, we did a 2-year project on WikiLeaks and the impact on democracy, also confirms that even decision makers, like the European Parliament or the European Economic and Social Committee, did not really have the time or the capacity or resources to go through all the information, for example, revealed by WikiLeaks, and were not able to use it as a question because of a question of time, resources, and lack of context for these documents. Or is it simply a general trend of disengagement and disenfranchisement of the youth, of younger people who feel that the cynicism of politics is not something they want to engage with full stop? Or are there different forms of political activism, such as through social media platforms, or project-specific short-term engagement, such as through advocacy online platforms like avars.org, for example, where you focus on a specific project for a specific time? Maybe there's a shift of political engagement during the last 40 years. It has to be also asked, and that's the media studies aspect, of the role of the mainstream media. The mainstream media have to focus on selling as many products as possible, and also to keep stories reasonably free from complexity. Is that maybe in itself a hindrance to really understanding and mobilizing citizens? If we just think about WikiLeaks, often we heard more about Julian Assange and his alleged rape case in Sweden than about the revelations of WikiLeaks itself. That might be also a problem. There are, though, finally, some recent experiments about institutionalizing deliberative and participatory democracy, bringing decision-making down to a citizen level. The big attempt was in 1992, for example, by the United Nations to start the so-called Local Agenda 21 process. This essentially meant, it's quite revolutionary, but not that well known, the UN at the Rio summit essentially stated the problems that we're facing are so huge, so overwhelming, economic, environment, social, political, peace and security, that we cannot solve them through governments, but all citizens have to be involved at the local level. So the idea was that local governance were supposed to set up agendas, which meant town hall meetings, where all of these problems would be broken down to the local level, and local people should be empowered, and also funds should be made available to tackle exactly those issues. There has been a big local agenda movement during the last 2 decades, but often these agendas focused more on environmental aspects and became depoliticized. It would be quite interesting to explore further to what extent this idea of the local agenda, of involving any kind of citizen in policy making at the locust level, could be revived or could be deepened. There, at the European Union level, the idea of direct democracy has been picked up by the idea of petitions. If 1 million citizens sign up to a certain petition, the institutions have to respond. It has been greeted by some muted enthusiasm because it was seen more or less like a PR approach and not so much as an engagement. But if you take it seriously, this could also be already a move towards a more direct democracy. Finally, in Belgium, where we're located right now, or more specifically Flanders, Flemish-speaking part of Belgium, the ministry has experimented with direct democracy in a very, very deep way. In 2012, the G1000 initiative was launched. This was the idea of getting local stakeholders to write in and to take part in a decision-making process on politics. And just now, as we speak, the current Minister for Culture, Education and Youth, Sven Gatz, together with an alumni from Vesalius College, Ziggy Vanderbiel, are working on a so-called citizen cabinet. There again, up to 1,000 citizens are encouraged to join the kind of cabinet in online, putting in their suggestions, their ideas, and then an even smaller group will be invited for active policy making. So there are experimentations and there are examples at the international level, Agenda 21, European level, the petition, and actually at the very local and regional level to institutionalize from mainstream politics more the involvement of citizens. To what extent this is really an answer to the big questions of deliberative democracy and participatory democracy, or whether it's more about a legitimization of the existing status quo, is a question that is fiercely debated and something that I also invite you to debate amongst yourself and reflect on. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to your reflections and debates.